Friends, in this video, we'll see the provisions relating to the time of supply under GST. Section 7 of the CGST Act gives the scope of supply. Section 9 deals with levy provision. Section 10 to Section 13 of the IGST Act deals with place of supply to determine the nature of transaction. Whether it is intrastate IGST is payable or whether it is intrastate CGST plus SGST is payable. Before going into the details of the provision of time of supply, let's first understand what is the relevance of the provision of time of supply. See, we are filing the GST return monthly. We are paying the GST liability monthly. To determine that a particular supply is for which month's return, the GST liability on that supply is for which month's return, we need to refer the provisions of time of supply. A single supply may involve several events. These events may be spread over a different period. So we need to determine that a particular supply is for which month's return. Liability is to be paid for which month's return. We need to refer the provision of time of supply. Let's take an example that on 25th May, I received a purchase order. On 31st May, I loaded the goods. On 3rd June, the customer received the goods. In the month on 1st July, the customer paid the amount. I raised the invoice in the month of June. Now the question is whether this transaction, this supply is to be disclosed in June month's return of the GST or July or May when the purchase order is received, because someone will say that you received the purchase order, that is a time of supply. Or when the goods are loaded, the risk and reward of the ownership is transferred, that is the date of time of supply. When the goods are received, that is by the customer, that is the time of supply. Someone will say until the payment is received, the transaction is not over, so that is not a time of supply. Someone will say no, the whole GST is based on the invoice. The date of invoice is the time of supply. Therefore, a fiction has been created by the lawmakers to ignore all these things, refer only these parameters and determine that for which month's return this particular supply is to be disclosed and taxes to be paid. This is the relevance of the provision of time of supply. Let's go into the details of the provision of time of supply. Basically, the provision is divided into 4 parts: for goods and for services. In goods, for forward charge and reverse charge. In services, time of supply for forward charge and reverse charge. See, forward charge means when the supplier is liable to pay the tax. Reverse charge means when the recipient is liable to pay the tax. Now we'll see it for a forward charge. In case of goods, the date of invoice, if the invoice is raised within the time limit given under section 31 of the CGST Act, then the date of invoice or date of payment, whichever is earlier. If the invoice is not raised within the due date given under section 31, then you ignore the invoice date. And the due date for raising the invoice given under section 31 or the date of payment, whichever is earlier, is a time of supply. There is one notification 66/2017 which is issued for removal of difficulty, where it is provided that in case of goods, only in case of goods, if you received the advance, then on the advance the GST is not payable. GST is payable only on the date of issue of GST. Time of supply is date of issue of invoice or the date of, if not issued within time limit, then the due date under section 31. This is on advance. The GST liability is not payable only in case of supply of goods. In case of supply of services, if the advance is received, that is a time of supply and GST is payable. But what is advance? See, any consideration received before supply is an advance irrespective of the date of invoice. Again, any amount that is a consideration received for the supply before supply, irrespective of the date of invoice, is advance. Okay. Okay. Now in case of services, if the invoice is raised within the time prescribed under section 31, then the date of issue of invoice or the date of payment, whichever is earlier. If the invoice is not issued within the time limit prescribed under section 31, then the provision of service or the date of receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. See how you will see this provision. Whether the invoice is raised within the due date given under section 31, refer the date of invoice. If the invoice is not raised within the due date given under section 31, then you ignore the date of invoice and go to the day 1 of provision of service or the date of receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. Now let's see what is the time limit given under section 31 to raise the invoice. See, in case of goods, if there is a movement of goods involved, then before the movement of goods or on the date of movement of goods, the invoice is to be raised. In case the movement of goods is not involved, the goods are just made available to the supplier, that is warehouse goods, etc. Then when that goods are made available to the recipient, the invoice is to be raised before that or on that date. In case of supply of services, the due date for raising the invoice is within 30 days from the provision of service. Section 31 read with rule 47 of the CGST rule 2017. Here it is not the due date for raising the invoice that is 30 days from the provision of service. You need to go to the day 1 provision of service if the invoice is not raised within 30 days from the provision of service. This is the difference between goods and services. So you need to remember one thing, that goods are tangible, services are essentially intangible. Now let's see time of supply in case of reverse charge. In case of goods, the date of receipt of goods, the earlier of date of receipt of goods or date of payment enter in the books of recipient or the date of payment debited in the recipient's bank, whichever is earlier, or the date immediately following 30 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. 1 minute. What is mentioned here? Date immediately following 30 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. It means 31 days, not 30 days. Don't make mistake in the exam. Date immediately following 30 days. It means 31 days. Now see the reverse charge in case of services. Here there is no concept of provision of service because I already mentioned service are essentially intangible. So what is this? The time of supply in case of reverse charge is the earliest of date of payment enter in the books of accounts of the recipient or the date debited in the bank or the payment debited in the bank, whichever is earlier. Or the date immediately following 60 days from the date of issue of invoice. Date immediately following, in case of goods it is 30 days, in case of services it is 60 days. Date immediately following 60 days means 61 day. Let's take one example relating to the time of supply, that a supplier has received a purchase order of rupees 12 lakh. Along with that, he received 50,000 rupees advance to supply various components, and these components needs to be assembled at the customer side. Okay, on 4th July, the purchase order is received. for rupees 12 lakh. Along with that, 50,000 rupees advance is also received. On 10th August, machine is assembled, tested, accepted by the customer. On 16th August, the supplier raised the invoice. On 30th September, the balance amount of 11,50,000 is received. Now see, in this example, the 50,000 rupees advance is received as per the notification 66/2017. On 4th July, we will not pay the GST liability on 50,000 because this is an advance received. Before supply, any consideration received is an advance, and in case of supply of goods on advance, GST is not payable. That is not a time of supply. Now on 10th August, the machine is assembled, accepted by the customer. So according to section 31 of the CGST Act, the invoice is to be issued on 10th August or before 10th August. But you raise the invoice on 16th August. So you ignore the date of invoice. So the time of supply is 10th August because the payment is received on 30th September. And on 10th August, the time of supply is for the entire consideration of 12 lakh. Okay. Okay. Let's move ahead. Let's see one example of reverse charge mechanism in case of services, specifically taken services. See, there is no in this case there is nothing that in case of goods it is date of receipt of goods, one of the criteria. In services it is directly date of payment. When the payment is made recorded in the books of the recipient, 28th September. When the payment is debited in the recipient's bank, 30th September. So 28th September, 30th September, do the comparison. Whichever is earlier, 28th September. So ignore 30th September. Okay. Now the date of issue of invoice by the supplier is 20th July. Count 61 days. Friends, do not make mistake of counting of 60 days. Date immediately following. 60 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. So 61 day from 20 July is 19th September. Correct. So 19th September you will compare with 28th September. And the time of supply in this case is 19th September. Okay. There is one more provision in case of associated enterprise. Associated enterprise means the same definition as given in Income Tax Act section 92. The same provision is there. Same definition is there. Sorry, not same provision. Same definition is there for associated enterprise, where it is mentioned that the time of supply in case where the transaction is between associated enterprise, the service is between associated enterprise, the date of entry in the books of accounts of the recipient, that is also one criteria. So in this example, what is the date? 28 August is the date when the entry is made of the receipt of service in the recipient's book. So that is the earlier date. Therefore, that is the date for time of supply. That is only in case of associated enterprise, not in case of normal transactions. It is 19th September. Okay. Now see some issues relating to services that we saw the provisions that time of supply is the provision of service. 30 days from the provision of service, 60 days from the date of issue of invoice, etc. But what is the provision of service? Provision of service means the date on which the service is completed. But services are intangible. That is not so simple. In case of goods, at least you see the goods are moving. You are having a toll receipt. EV bill you are creating. But in case of services, they are inherently intangible. It is difficult to determine what is the provision of service, the date of provision of service. Let's take some examples. That let's take some issues relating to the provision of service. That on 31st May, sorry, on 31st March, when the books of accounts are closed, entry unbilled revenue is provided. That is unbilled revenue to revenue. That was an entry made. That does not mean that before 30th April you need to raise the invoice for that service, because that unbilled revenue is as per the accounting principle, as per the generally accepted accounting principles. That does not mean that the billing milestone to raise the invoice for the service has been achieved. So unbilled revenue, recording of unbilled revenue in the books of accounts is a separate thing, and the provision of service under GST is a separate. These are two different things. Do not mix. Officers are mixing this. That is different story. In some cases, this is especially found in case of the software company, that when the service is rendered, they need client's approval about the acceptance that yes, this service is rendered. So the provision of service is not when you rendered the service, but when the client issues a certificate about the yes, I received this service, you raise the invoice. Approval from the project manager of the customer. That is the provision of service. Only after that you can raise the invoice. Then 30 days is to be calculated from that date, not from the date when you completed the service. Okay. Okay. Similar to the unbilled revenue, suppose the recipient provided accrued expenses. That does not mean that within 30 days you need to raise the invoice, because that accrued expenses is as per the accounting principle. That is nothing to do with billing milestone under GST for raising the invoice for services. Okay. Okay. I thought that we need to discuss some issues, and this is not so simple at the provision of service. It's not so simple. There is one more concept of continuous supply. See section 2 subsection 32 and section 2 subsection 33 define continuous supply of goods and continuous supply of services respectively. Let's take an example that there is a CEO office where they are having a contract with the water supplier to supply daily 2 jars of water of 20 liters. This is an example of continuous supply of service, continuous supply of goods. And continuous supply of service, let's take an example that a chartered accountant is filing the return of a client for more than 3 months is a continuous supply of service. So the time of supply provisions are different for continuous supply of goods and continuous supply of service. Let's see what it is. In case of continuous supply of goods, when a successive statement is created, the date of the invoice is to be raised on the date of issue of successive statement or before that, and that is the time of supply. In case the invoice is not raised, then date of receipt of payment is the time of supply. Okay, and in case of continuous supply of service, the time of supply is as per the contract. What is the due date for payment in case of continuous supply of service? On that date, the invoice is to be raised, or before that, or receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. If the invoice is not raised as per the due date given in the contract, then you ignore the date of invoice. What is the date of receipt of payment or the due date for raising the invoice? Whichever is earlier, that is a time of supply in case of continuous supply of service. Further, one more element, that if in a continuous supply of services, the completion of service is relating to some event, then the completion of that event is the time of supply. GST liability is payable on that day. That is time of supply. Okay. Okay. Let's say one more. There is one more aspect of time of supply in case of voucher. What is voucher? Another form of money. Simple definition of voucher. Another form of money is a voucher. Let's take an example that you go on Amazon site and purchased a voucher of rupees 5,000. I am taking Amazon example for the purpose of understanding, no other intention. On when you received that voucher, there is some validity that within 3 months, within 6 months, you have to utilize that. You can utilize for purchase of any goods or availment of any service available on the Amazon site. So on the date of issue of voucher, whether the supply of goods or supply of service is identified? No, it is not identified. So the time of supply in such a case is the date when you redeem the voucher. When you actually utilize that voucher for purchase of goods or availment of service, that is a time of supply. In case if the voucher is issued and it is having a fixed and determinable manner of utilization, then the date of issue of voucher is the time of supply. Let's take an example that someone told me that in telecommunication industry, they issue the voucher of rupees 100 or rupees 500, which can be used only for calling and data, that is internet services. So in this case, the time of supply is the date of issue of voucher, because for what purpose it can be used, that is determinable on the date of issue of voucher. That is, you can use for calling or for internet. So that is a time of supply. Date of issue of voucher is a time of supply, whether it is when it is determinable. When it is not determinable, then the date of redemption of voucher, that is actually utilization of voucher for purchase of goods or availment of service, that is a time of supply. See, just as a passing reference, what I'm saying, that when you purchase the voucher on Amazon site, what accounting entry Amazon will do? They will do the balance sheet to balance sheet entry. That is bank account debit to liability. And when you redeem the voucher, when you purchase the goods or when you purchase the service, or when you avail the services, on that date, Amazon will book the revenue, that is liability account debit to revenue. Just as a passing reference. Yeah. Now let's see. There is one more concept. Change in tax rate. I have to make the thing simple for you. There are 3 events when there is a change in tax rate. Correct? Correct. What are the 3 events? Provision of service. 1. Issuance of invoice, date of issue of invoice. 2nd. Receipt of payment is a 3rd event. If out of these 3 events, any 2 events happen before the change in tax rate, apply the old rate. If out of these 3 events, any 2 events happen after the rate change in the rate, then apply the new rate. That's it. Please go through this table. I have given various combinations, and in the last column, what is the date, whether it is before the change, before or after the new rate or old rate to be applied. Okay, just go through this table. This change in tax rate is dealt in section 14 of the CGST Act. Now there is an example. Let's see this example. On 1st August, in case of services, on 1st August you received the advance. Okay. On 1st September invoice is raised. On 2nd September the rate changed from 12% to 18%. GST rate change. This is just a hypothetical example for the purpose of understanding the concept of change in rate. What is the time of supply? On 3rd September service provided. So the 2 events, that is receipt of consideration and the issue of invoice, is before the rate change. Therefore the old rate of 12% is applied. Okay. Okay. Now there is a residue provision that we saw, the time of supply in case of forward charge, reverse charge. If your case is not fitting in any of the above provision, lawmakers provided a residue provision that you made the supply. It means you need to file the return. What is the due date for filing the return? That is the time of supply. Residue provision. Now come to the important and very interesting situation or the case. That in case, what is the time of supply in case the interest on delayed in payment received? What is the time of supply? See, there are three aspects. Understand carefully. One, any consideration received in the form of interest for the loan given is exempt interest. One aspect. This is the interest for delay in payment of consideration for the supply of goods or providing of services. This is not exempt. This is chargeable to tax. Under which provision this is chargeable to tax? Section 15, see section 15 subsection 2 of the valuation rule. This is to be included in the price to arrive at the value on which GST is payable. Section 15 subsection 2 of the CGST Act. Now, when it is to be paid, when this transaction is to be included and when the GST is to be paid on this is on the date of receipt of that interest. That is the time of supply. Not on accrual basis. See, let's go one step back. GST is on supply of goods and services, irrespective of the amount received, money received. So, can we say that the GST is based on accrual system of accounting? Yes, it is based on accrual system of accounting. Only in this case, on receipt, the GST is paid. Okay, let's take example. Suppose you exported the services, zero rented. The amount is not received. Bad debts. When you export the service, you pass the entry as AR to revenue. And if the amount is not received, you are not going to reverse this entry. What is the event? Bad debt. So you will record the event of bad debt. Bad debts to AR. But this was an export. Zero rated. Amount is not received in convertible foreign currency. So go and pay the GST liability with interest, because GST is payable on the provision of service, not subject to receipt of money. Okay, this is for overall understanding of the GST law. Let's see one example. That on 1st July, you supplied the goods. On 1st August, this is a due date for consideration as per contract, that the customer needs to pay within 30 days. He paid after 30 days, made a delay of further 30 days. So the interest is levied of rupees 6,000. A customer paid the interest of rupees 6,000 in the month of on 31st August. So this interest is to be disclosed in August month's return. Okay, on the basis only on receipt, not calculation on the accrual basis. Okay. Now one question, that the invoice is raised when the principal supply is made. This interest, when you will disclose in GSTR1, you will not raise the invoice. Remember friends, the invoice will be raised only when there is a supply, transfer of ownership of goods from one person to another, or provision of service or conducting of certain activities from by one person for the another person. So in this case, the principal supply is already done on the invoice. You received 6,000 as an interest for delay in payment of consideration. So these things, for this 6,000 you will issue a debit note, not the invoice. Okay. Okay. So this interest is not having any independent existence. This is to be added as per section 15 subsection 2 in the price to arrive at the value for the purpose for GST. So the HSN and the GST rate of principal supply will apply to this interest also. No separate existence. Okay. The purpose of this video is to discuss this provision, the overall accounting of GST, what is in case, what is a voucher, what is the time of supply in case of voucher, what is the time of supply, what is the in case of forward charge, what is the difference between goods and services. I want to leave you with a deep thinking on this interest element, especially. Okay. Okay. Thank you. This is my email ID. If you are having any questions relating to GST, you can send a mail to me at catusharji@gmail.com, and my cell number is 8080980684. You can call me at 9:30 p.m. to 10 p.m. Thank you.